By the time I pulled into Maple Ridge Estates that Monday morning, the concrete was still pale, the caution tape was still fluttering, and 6 feet of my property had already disappeared. I had been gone for 6 days on a hospital maintenance job. When I left, 3 dogwood trees stood beside my house. A stone border marked the edge of the garden, and an iron survey pin sat exactly where it had been since I bought the property. When I came back, the trees were gone. The stones had been ripped out. A brand new driveway stretched across the strip of land where my father and I had worked together 3 summers earlier. At the end of that driveway sat Gary Whitmore's 35-foot RV. A white vinyl fence had been installed beside it, cutting deep into my yard. Near my maple tree, someone had driven an orange stake into the ground, as if a bright piece of plastic could rewrite a recorded property line. Gary came out of his garage before I had even shut off my engine. His face was red, his shoulders were rigid, and one hand kept stabbing toward the new concrete, while the other gripped a folder of HOA papers. Linda Carver, the HOA vice president, hurried across the street behind him, carrying a violation notice with my name on it. Within seconds, they were treating me like the trespasser. Gary kicked one of my father's remaining border stones away from the driveway and insisted the new marker prove the land belonged to him. Linda handed me a $500 fine for interfering with an approved improvement project. The concrete crew stood nearby in silence, watching the owner of the damaged property get threatened on his own lawn. I felt the anger rise so fast that my hands started shaking. But I did not touch the fence. I did not step onto the concrete. I did not give Gary the argument he wanted. Instead, I looked up at the small security camera mounted beneath my roof. Gary had assumed it stopped recording when I left town. He had no idea it ran on a backup battery, saved motion clips to the cloud, and had captured every early morning visit to that side yard. 4 months later, that driveway would be cut apart under county supervision. Linda would lose her position on the HOA board. Gary would be forced into a settlement worth $48,000. But that morning, he was still smiling. He believed moving one metal pin had moved the law with it. He was wrong. 3 years before Gary tore up the side of my yard, Maple Ridge Estates had looked like the safest place in the world to start over. I was 39, recently divorced, and exhausted from living out of boxes and temporary apartments. I worked as an electrical maintenance technician for a regional hospital, which meant long shifts, emergency call-outs, and weekends spent tracing failures through walls most people never thought about. The job was steady, but nothing about my life felt settled. The house on Cedar Hollow Lane was not large. It had faded brick, an aging roof, and a backyard that sloped slightly toward a drainage ditch. But it was the first property I had ever owned by myself. Every payment came from years of overtime, canceled vacations, and money I had saved one paycheck at a time. My father, Frank, understood what that meant to me. He came over almost every Saturday during my first summer there. Together, we repaired the irrigation line, leveled the narrow strip beside the garage, and carried in heavy stones to build a border around 3 young dogwood trees. He was already slowing down by then, although neither of us liked to admit it. He would rest on an overturned bucket, point out where the next stone should go, then insist on lifting it himself. That strip of ground was only a few feet wide, but it held some of my clearest memories of him. My father died from a heart attack the following winter. After that, I became protective of the little things he had touched. I kept the border exactly where we had placed it. I pruned the dogwoods every spring. I even left one uneven stone near the back because he had laughed when it refused to sit flat. The closing documents for the house included a boundary survey. The property line ran from the front corner near my garage to an iron survey pin beside the rear maple tree. The dogwoods and stone border were entirely inside my lot. At the time, I treated the survey like most homeowners probably do. I placed it in a folder with the deed, title policy, and mortgage papers, then stored everything in a filing cabinet. I never imagined that folder would eventually become more valuable than any tool in my garage. Gary Whitmore had lived next door for almost 8 years before I arrived. He owned a small roofing company and liked everyone to know it. His trucks took up most of his driveway, his employees came and went at odd hours, and building materials often appeared beside his garage without warning. At first, I tried to be a good neighbor. When his trash cans rolled onto my lawn, I moved them back. When his workers crossed my side yard carrying ladders, I let it go. When one of his trailers left tire marks in the grass, I repaired the damage myself. None of it seemed worth starting a feud over. Gary took my patience as permission. He gradually began parking closer to the property line. His equipment crept farther onto the grass. During HOA meetings, he spoke as if the neighborhood belonged to people who had lived there longest, and newer owners were expected to adjust. The real problem started when he bought a 35-foot motorhome. His existing driveway was too narrow to guide the RV behind his house. The garage wall blocked one side, and the recorded property line blocked the other. To create enough clearance, he needed several feet of my land. Gary first approached me with an offer of $2,000 for the side strip. I refused. Selling that land would have placed his pavement close to my foundation, interfered with drainage, and destroyed the 3 dogwoods my father had helped me plant. It also could have created setback problems if I ever wanted to modify my garage. I believed that explanation would be enough. Instead, Gary began telling people that the original property markers were inaccurate. He claimed the neighborhood plat had been drawn incorrectly and that part of my side yard had always belonged to his lot. He had no stamped survey, no county document, and no legal ruling. He simply repeated the claim until it started sounding official. Linda Carver, the HOA vice president, gave him credibility. She and Gary's wife were close friends, and Linda often treated HOA approval as if it could override county records and private ownership. I still did not see the danger. I thought Gary was frustrated about the RV. I thought Linda was careless. I thought recorded boundaries were too clear for either of them to challenge seriously. That was my mistake. When someone wants part of your property badly enough, they do not always begin by taking it. Sometimes they begin by changing the story around it. And if you have ever ignored a misplaced stake, an unfamiliar paint mark, or a neighbor's casual claim about where your land ends, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who owns property, and save it as a reminder that the paperwork buried in a filing cabinet can become the only thing standing between a homeowner and someone determined to rewrite the boundary. 2 weeks before my work trip, white paint appeared beside my father's stone border. Gary said it marked a utility line. It did not. The white paint appeared on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before I left for the hospital project. It ran in a broken line beside the stone border my father and I had built, then curved toward the rear maple tree. At first glance, it looked like a utility marking. Gary said a contractor had checked for underground lines before repairing drainage near his garage, and I had no reason to believe he was planning anything larger. Still, something about the line bothered me. It sat too close to the dogwoods and did not match the route of any water, gas, or electrical service shown in my closing documents. Before leaving for work, I took several photographs with my phone. I captured the stones, the trees, the old iron survey pin, and the white marks in the same frame. That simple decision later became one of the most important things I did. The following week, Gary submitted an architectural request to the HOA for what he described as a minor driveway extension. The drawing attached to his application looked official from a distance, but it was only a rough site sketch. It had no surveyor's seal, no measurements tied to recorded monuments, and no proof that the proposed pavement remained inside his lot. Linda approved it anyway. I did not learn about the approval until after the concrete had been poured. On Sunday evening, I packed for a 6-day trip to supervise electrical maintenance at a hospital campus 2 counties away. Before leaving, I walked around the side yard and checked the irrigation system. The dogwoods were healthy. The stone border was undisturbed. The iron survey pin was still visible beside the maple tree. By the next morning, Gary had begun removing all of it. My security camera recorded the first motion at 5:41 a.m. Gary entered my side yard carrying a shovel. Another man followed him, wearing a reflective vest and work boots. They moved directly to the rear survey pin, scraped away the soil, and dug around the iron rod until it came loose. Gary lifted it from the ground, wiped off the dirt, and placed it inside a black toolbox. Then the other man measured toward my house. Together, they drove an orange construction stake into the lawn nearly 6 feet from the original location. Gary tied a strip of bright ribbon around it and photographed the new position from several angles. By sunrise, the legal boundary had not changed, but the physical evidence on the ground had been rearranged to make it look as though it had. A landscaping crew arrived later that morning. They removed the stones one by one and loaded them into a trailer. The 3 dogwoods were cut near the base, their roots pulled out with a compact excavator. One of the machine tracks crushed an irrigation pipe, releasing water beneath the soil for hours. The next day, workers spread gravel across the strip. They installed wooden forms, compacted the base, and prepared the area for concrete. Gary told them the land belonged to him. He also told Helen Brooks, the neighbor across the street, that I had agreed to the project before leaving town. Because the HOA had approved the application and the work looked organized, no one thought they were watching a property line being erased in real time. By Wednesday afternoon, a wide slab of fresh concrete connected Gary's driveway to the side gate. A white vinyl fence followed the false line marked by the orange stake. The opening was now wide enough for his motorhome to pass beside the garage. When I returned on Monday, the transformation was so complete that for several seconds I questioned my own memory. The dogwoods were gone. The stone border had vanished. The new fence blocked my view of the ground where the original pin had been. Gary's RV sat behind it as if the space had always belonged to him. The confrontation began before I had removed my luggage from the truck. Gary crossed the new driveway with a folder under his arm and acted as though my arrival was the problem. He claimed the orange stake represented the correct boundary and insisted a construction professional had verified it. He treated my closing survey as an outdated piece of paper and the new concrete as final proof of ownership. Linda arrived moments later, carrying an HOA violation notice. Instead of questioning why Gary had built so close to the property line without a stamped survey, she accused me of obstructing an approved improvement. The notice imposed a $500 fine and warned that additional penalties could be added if I interfered with the fence, driveway, or contractor access. The damage to my yard was being used as evidence against me. I pointed toward the place where the dogwoods had stood. Gary dismissed them as ordinary landscaping. I indicated the missing stones and the broken irrigation line. Linda described those issues as a private maintenance dispute. Then Gary made the mistake that removed any doubt about what he was doing. He offered me $3,000 to sign a statement accepting the new boundary. The amount was slightly higher than his original offer, but the purpose had changed. He was no longer asking to buy my land. He was asking me to legitimize what he had already taken. When I refused, his posture changed. He warned that lawyers were expensive, survey disputes could last for years, and I would spend more protecting the strip than it was worth. His confidence came from the concrete beneath his feet. He believed the cost of removing it would pressure me into surrendering. That evening, I attended an emergency HOA meeting with my closing survey in hand. Linda controlled the agenda. She allowed Gary's driveway application to be described as approved, but she would not let the board determine whether the construction crossed onto my property. She claimed the HOA could not settle private boundary disputes while continuing to enforce fines against me based on that same disputed boundary. Gary sat at the far end of the table, calm and satisfied. The strategy was obvious. He wanted the fence and pavement to remain long enough for everyone in the neighborhood to become accustomed to them. Once the new layout looked permanent, he expected me to appear unreasonable for demanding that it be removed. I left the meeting with a violation notice, a damaged yard, and no support from the people who were supposed to apply the rules fairly. But when I reached home, I did not call Gary. I did not touch the fence. I did not post accusations online. I went inside, locked the door, opened the security application on my computer, and selected the first morning I had been away. At 5:41 a.m., the screen showed Gary walking into my yard with a shovel. And when I watched him pull the survey pin from the ground with his own hands, the entire dispute changed. I watched the security footage 3 times before I trusted myself to react. The first time, I felt angry. The second time, I felt sick. By the third, I understood that the video was more valuable than any argument I could have made in Gary's driveway. I did not send him a copy. I did not warn Linda. I did not post a single frame online. Instead, I downloaded the original files directly from the camera system. I saved the motion clips, the longer recordings before and after each event, and the device information showing when the footage had been created. I copied everything to an external drive, uploaded a second copy to encrypted cloud storage, and placed a third copy on a flash drive that stayed in my desk at work. Then I began building a timeline. At 5:41 on Monday morning, Gary entered my yard with a shovel. At 5:47, the original survey pin came out of the ground. At 5:55, the orange stake went in. At 8:12, the landscaping crew arrived. By noon, the first dogwood had been cut down. By Wednesday afternoon, the concrete had covered the place where the stone border and irrigation line had been. I wrote down every timestamp, every vehicle, every worker, and every visible action. I took still images from the footage and matched them with photographs I had taken before leaving town. One of those older photographs showed the original iron pin beside a distinctive gray stone. The shape of that stone, the position of the maple tree, and the corner of my garage created a reference point that was nearly impossible to dispute. The next morning, I opened the filing cabinet where I kept my closing papers. The folder contained my deed, title insurance policy, mortgage documents, subdivision plat, and the boundary survey completed when I purchased the house. The survey showed the property line exactly where I remembered it. The dogwood trees, irrigation line, and stone border were all inside my lot. I scanned every page and made copies. Then I drove to the county register of deeds. The clerk helped me locate the recorded plat for Maple Ridge Estates. I ordered a certified copy and compared it with my closing survey. The bearings, distances, and lot dimensions matched. Nothing in the county record supported Gary's new orange stake. My next stop was the county permitting office. Gary had received a permit for a driveway extension, but the permit file contained only a rough site sketch. The sketch had no surveyor's seal, no verified boundary measurements, and no evidence that the proposed work had been checked against the recorded property line. The permit also included a statement that the property owner was responsible for keeping all construction inside the legal lot boundaries. Gary had signed it. That document changed the tone of the investigation. He could no longer claim he believed the HOA approval settled ownership. The county had placed responsibility directly on him. I hired Tom Alvarez, a licensed land surveyor recommended by a coworker at the hospital. Tom arrived with equipment that looked far more sophisticated than the tape measure and orange stake Gary had relied on. He studied the recorded plat, located several surviving monuments in the neighborhood, and established control points before measuring my lot. He did not begin with the fence, he began with the records. That distinction mattered. After nearly 4 hours, Tom showed me the preliminary results. Gary's new fence sat inside my property. At the narrowest point, the encroachment measured 5 feet 8 inches. Near the rear gate, it exceeded 6 feet. The driveway, vinyl fence, and part of the RV access lane were all on my side of the recorded boundary. Tom then used a metal detector near the location shown in my old photographs. Beneath disturbed soil, he found a broken section of steel and a compacted cavity where the original monument had been removed. The ground did not look weathered or naturally shifted. It looked recently dug. Tom documented everything with photographs, field notes, coordinates, and measurements. He marked the true line with temporary stakes placed according to the recorded plat, then warned me not to remove or alter anything until the evidence had been reviewed by an attorney. That afternoon, I contacted Rachel Bennett, a real estate attorney who handled boundary and easement disputes. Rachel reviewed the deed, survey, county plat, permit file, HOA notices, photographs, and camera footage. Her advice was simple: stop speaking to Gary in person and move every future communication into writing. From that moment forward, I answered nothing at the fence. When Gary sent messages telling me to accept the $3,000 offer, I saved them. When Linda emailed another HOA warning, I saved that too. When Gary claimed the original survey was inaccurate, I asked him in writing to provide the stamped survey supporting his claim. He never did. Rachel sent preservation letters to Gary, Linda, the HOA, and the contractor. The letters required them to retain emails, text messages, site plans, invoices, photographs, security footage, and internal approval records connected to the driveway project. That request created immediate pressure. The contractor responded first. He provided a work authorization signed by Gary, along with a written statement that Gary accepted responsibility for the property line and represented that the entire construction area belonged to him. The contractor also produced text messages showing that Gary wanted the work completed while I was out of town. I contacted my title insurance company and opened a notice of potential boundary encroachment. I photographed the broken irrigation system, collected estimates for replacing the trees, and asked a landscape specialist to calculate the cost of restoring the side yard. I kept receipts for everything. Gary continued acting confident in public, but his messages became more careful. He stopped calling the orange stake a legal marker and started referring to the situation as a misunderstanding. Linda stopped mentioning the $500 fine and began asking whether the matter could be handled privately. I did not agree. By then, I had learned something important about property disputes. The person who speaks first does not control the outcome. The person who creates the most complete record often does. And the record was about to become much worse for Gary. Buried inside the contractor's files was a signed document stating that Gary owned the entire construction area. Attached to that same file was an older survey showing that he knew he did not. Rachel called me the morning after she finished reviewing the contractor's files. Her voice was calm, but the way she paused before explaining what she had found told me this was no longer just a boundary dispute. Gary had signed a work authorization stating that he owned the entire area where the driveway, fence, and RV gate were being installed. That document alone made him responsible for the contractor's reliance on his claim. But attached to the same file was a copy of the survey from when Gary purchased his house 8 years earlier. The survey showed the exact same property line as mine. It placed the iron monument beside my maple tree. It showed the narrow strip beside my garage entirely inside my lot. It left no reasonable possibility that Gary had simply misunderstood where the boundary was. He had known. He had possessed written proof that the land was mine, then signed a statement claiming the opposite so the contractor would proceed. That discovery destroyed the explanation Gary had been using since I came home. He could no longer blame an outdated survey, a confused worker, or a harmless disagreement between neighbors. The paper trail showed that before the first tree was removed, he already had the correct line in his possession. Rachel compared the older survey with Tom Alvarez's new stamped survey and the recorded subdivision plat. All three documents aligned. The new survey measured the encroachment at 5 feet 8 inches near the front of the fence and 6 feet 3 inches near the RV gate. The concrete slab, the vinyl fence, part of the gate structure, and a buried drainage channel all crossed onto my property. This was not a minor construction error. It was a deliberate project built around a false boundary. The camera footage made the situation worse for Gary. The video showed him entering my yard before sunrise, digging around the original monument, lifting it from the ground, and placing it inside a toolbox. Minutes later, he helped install the orange stake that he later presented as proof of ownership. The timestamps matched the contractor's schedule. The site photographs matched the position of the trees, the stone border, and the maple. Tom's field notes identified disturbed soil and broken steel at the original monument location. Every piece of evidence supported the next. Then Rachel received the HOA's internal emails. 3 days before I left town, Linda had written to Gary that the architectural committee could approve the appearance of a driveway but could not determine private ownership. She specifically warned him to obtain a licensed boundary survey before construction began. Gary replied that the work needed to be completed during the week I was away. He also wrote that once the concrete was down, I would be unlikely to spend the money required to challenge it. Linda did not stop the project. Instead, she approved the application using Gary's unsealed sketch, then issued fines against me when I objected. The official HOA meeting minutes contained no mention of her warning, no disclosure of her friendship with Gary's family, and no indication that the board had reviewed a stamped survey. Rachel explained that HOA approval could not transfer ownership, move a recorded boundary, or authorize construction on someone else's land. It only meant the association had approved the visible design under its own rules. Gary had treated that limited approval as a weapon. Linda had helped him do it. Rachel prepared a formal demand package. It included the deed, the certified county plat, both surveys, the permit application, Gary's signed ownership statement, contractor messages, HOA emails, photographs, repair estimates, and selected still frames from the camera footage. The letter demanded immediate cessation of all use of the disputed strip. It required removal of the driveway extension, fence, gate, and drainage channel. It demanded restoration of the irrigation system, soil, stone border, and landscaping. It also sought reimbursement for survey fees, attorney costs, loss of use, and the destruction of the dogwoods. The letter required the HOA to withdraw every violation notice issued against me and preserve all internal records connected to the approval. Gary responded through an attorney. His first position was that the camera footage violated his privacy. Rachel rejected that argument because the camera was mounted on my house and recorded activity occurring inside my yard. His second position was that the worker in the reflective vest had moved the monument without his knowledge. The video showed Gary holding the shovel, removing the iron pin and carrying it away. His third position was that the boundary remained uncertain. 3 matching surveys and a certified county plat said otherwise. Each excuse collapsed against a different piece of evidence. The contractor's insurance representative soon contacted Rachel. The company did not want to defend construction performed outside the client's property after the client had signed a false ownership statement. The contractor offered records, photographs, and witness cooperation to separate its liability from Gary's actions. That left Gary increasingly isolated. The HOA's attorney advised the board that Linda's approval did not protect him, and that continuing to enforce fines against me could expose the association to additional claims. For the first time since the project began, Gary stopped sending threatening messages. He removed the $3,000 offer from the table and asked whether I would accept a private correction to the fence. I would not. A narrow fence adjustment would have left concrete, drainage work, and damaged soil on my property. It would also have allowed Gary to avoid responsibility for removing the monument and destroying the trees. By then, the dispute was no longer about recovering 6 feet of grass. It was about restoring the legal boundary and making sure no one in Maple Ridge could pretend the takeover had been an innocent mistake. Rachel gave Gary 10 business days to agree to removal and compensation before filing for an injunction. On the 9th day, the county permitting office received Tom's stamped survey and opened a formal review of the driveway permit. On the 10th, a county inspector arrived at the property. A sheriff's deputy pulled in behind him. Gary had spent weeks acting as though concrete made his claim permanent. Now the people carrying official records were standing on top of it. The county inspector stepped out first, carrying a tablet, a rolled site plan, and the kind of expression that made it clear he had not come to negotiate. Deputy Marcus Reed parked behind him and remained near the patrol vehicle while the inspector compared Gary's permit file with Tom Alvarez's stamped survey. Gary came out of his garage almost immediately. For weeks, he had acted as though the driveway itself proved ownership. That morning, the fresh concrete no longer looked permanent. It looked like evidence. The inspector began at the front edge of the extension. He checked the recorded lot dimensions, located Tom's temporary survey stakes, and followed the true boundary toward the rear gate. Every few yards, he stopped to enter measurements and take photographs. The fence crossed the line. The pavement crossed the line. The drainage channel beneath the gravel base crossed the line. Near the rear of the property, part of the gate structure stood more than 6 feet inside my lot. Gary tried to explain that the HOA had approved the project. The inspector told him the architectural committee could approve materials, color, and appearance, but it could not authorize construction on land he did not own. Gary then pointed to the orange stake. Tom's survey, the county plat, and the original closing records all placed the legal boundary somewhere else. The orange stake had no surveyor's cap, no recorded reference, and no legal authority. The inspector opened Gary's permit application on the tablet and showed him the certification he had signed. It stated that all work would remain within the legal property boundaries and that the owner accepted responsibility for any encroachment. Gary's signature was at the bottom. The county issued a formal notice of violation before leaving the driveway. The permit was placed under review, use of the expanded section was prohibited, and a stop work order was attached to the RV gate. Gary's motorhome was now trapped behind a structure he could not legally use. Deputy Reed then asked to see the camera footage. I played the original files from the secure copy, beginning several minutes before Gary entered the yard. The deputy watched him walk toward the survey monument, dig around it, remove it, and carry it away. He watched Gary help place the orange stake. He watched the landscaping crew arrive later that morning. When the video ended, Gary claimed the worker in the reflective vest had told him the marker was wrong. Deputy Reed asked whether that worker was a licensed surveyor. Gary had no answer. The deputy explained that he was not there to decide a civil boundary case or order payment. That would be handled through the courts or a settlement. But the removal of a survey monument, the destruction of landscaping, and the recorded entry onto my property were serious enough to document in an official incident report. He collected copies of the video, photographs, survey, and contractor records. For the first time, the dispute had a report number. Gary could no longer reduce it to a misunderstanding between difficult neighbors. The pressure increased again at the next HOA meeting. Rachel attended with me and placed a complete evidence packet in front of every board member. It included the certified subdivision plat, Tom's survey, the county violation, Gary's permit certification, the contractor's messages, and Linda's internal email warning that a licensed boundary survey was required before construction. The room changed as soon as the board read Gary's reply. He had written that the project needed to be completed while I was away and that I probably would not spend the money to fight once the concrete was down. Linda attempted to describe the message as frustration taken out of context. Rachel then displayed the violation notices Linda had issued against me after receiving that email. The board members finally understood what had happened. Linda had known the HOA lacked authority to determine ownership. She had known no stamped survey supported Gary's plan. She had still approved the project, then used HOA fines to pressure the person whose land had been taken. The board voted to cancel every violation against me and refund the fee I had already paid. It suspended Linda from her position pending an independent review and hired outside counsel to determine whether the association faced liability. Residents who had once assumed I was overreacting began asking why the board had never been shown the full application. Gary sat against the wall with his arms folded, but he no longer looked confident. The contractor's insurer also changed its position. After reviewing Gary's signed ownership statement and the older survey found in his own files, the company refused to accept full responsibility for a project based on information he had misrepresented. The contractor agreed to cooperate, provide witness statements, and testify about Gary's instructions if the case went to court. That left Gary facing the county, the sheriff's report, the HOA's attorneys, my attorney, and the possibility that his own insurer would not cover intentional conduct. Rachel prepared a complaint seeking an injunction, damages, restoration costs, attorney fees, and an order establishing the recorded boundary. The morning before she planned to file it, Gary requested mediation. He was no longer offering $3,000. He was asking how much it would cost to keep the case out of court. At the mediation table, Rachel placed the restoration estimates, legal expenses, survey costs, landscaping valuation, and removal bids into a single calculation. The number at the bottom was $48,000. For the first time since I had returned home, Gary did not argue that the land belonged to him. He asked whether he could pay in installments. The mediation ended with a written settlement that totaled $48,000. $17,500 covered the removal of the concrete extension, the vinyl fence, and the RV gate. $8,200 paid for the damaged irrigation line, soil replacement, drainage repairs, and reconstruction of the stone border. $7,800 covered the replacement of the 3 dogwoods and long-term landscaping care. Another $9,500 reimbursed part of my survey, attorney, and expert costs. The final $5,000 settled the remaining claims for trespass, property damage, and loss of use. Gary had 30 days to make the first payment. He also had to sign a recorded boundary acknowledgement accepting Tom Alvarez's survey as the legal property line. The document prohibited him from placing vehicles, pavement, fencing, drainage structures, or construction materials across that line in the future. The county required the demolition work to be completed under inspection. Watching the concrete come out felt different from watching it go in. There was no shouting, no crowd, and no dramatic confrontation. A saw cut through the slab in straight sections. A small excavator lifted the broken pieces onto a trailer. The false orange stake disappeared, and the ground beneath it was opened again. Gary stayed inside most of that day. His RV remained trapped behind the side yard until the original driveway was cleared. A few weeks later, he sold it. Without the 6 feet he had tried to take from me, there was no legal way to park it beside his house. The HOA formally canceled every violation notice issued against me and refunded the money I had paid. The board adopted a new rule requiring a stamped boundary survey before approving major construction near a property line. Linda resigned before the independent review was complete. No criminal charges were announced, but the emails became public during the HOA process, and residents saw exactly how she had used her position. The damage to her reputation was permanent. At the next election, every board candidate promised greater transparency and written conflict of interest rules. Gary's roofing business also felt the consequences. Several neighbors stopped referring clients to him after learning he had signed a false ownership statement and blamed the contractor when the project failed. Tom returned after the demolition and set a new survey monument at the verified location. He filed the updated survey with the county so the boundary could not be distorted again by a missing pin or a convenient sketch. I rebuilt the stone border using as many of the original rocks as I could recover. Near the back, I found the uneven gray stone my father had once struggled to level. One corner had been chipped by the excavator, but I placed it back in almost the same position. Then I planted 3 new dogwoods. They were smaller than the trees Gary destroyed, and it would take years before their branches filled the space again. But they were on my land, behind a recorded line, protected by documents that no one in Maple Ridge could pretend not to understand. People sometimes ask whether winning the case made living next to Gary uncomfortable. It did. We never became friendly. He rarely looked in my direction, and I never expected an apology. But peace does not always mean repairing a relationship. Sometimes it means making the boundary so clear that the other person can no longer cross it without consequences. That was enough for me. If this story made you think about your own deed, closing survey, security cameras, or property markers, save it and share it with someone who owns a home. Leave a comment with what you would have done when you saw that fresh concrete, and subscribe for more stories about homeowners who protected their property without threats, destruction, or revenge. Gary believed power came from moving first, pouring concrete, and making the damage look permanent. I learned that real power came from something quieter: a photograph taken before a trip, a camera that kept recording, a survey stored in a filing cabinet, and the patience to let the evidence speak louder than the person who thought he could move the truth 6 feet to the side.